And now, airing from Rye, the Quatious podcast.
And welcome to the Quatious Podcast, U.S. History Edition. We're out here learning history because those who don't are doomed to repeat it. And we're joined today by the renowned professor of political science at Princeton University. Please welcome Professor George.
Hi there, hello.
Hi there, hello. We are not the same person.
Weird that you felt the need to specify
No,
that.
it's not. After all, you and I, we're totally different people.
Alright, sure. What are we talking about today?
We're going to be comparing and contrasting progressivism throughout U.S. history, specifically the progressivism in the early 20th century versus today's.
Fascinating.
But before we get started, I just wanted to give a huge thanks to the sponsor of today's episode, Apple. Apple, we're going to keep using child labor in our offshore sweatshops, but we made one progressive ad, so we're woke now, we decided. So give us all your money for our not at all overpriced goods. Right now. Come on, we deserve it. And whatevs, you'll buy the newest iPhone regardless.
That was a spoof, right?
Well, that depends on if Apple's willing to give me that money.
Okay.
Alrighty then, Professor George, could you get us started with the roots of early progressivism?
Yeah, so to understand that, you gotta understand the Gilded Age. Of course, to be gilded means for an item to be covered thinly with gold. The item itself is not gold. The name of the Gilded Age is actually quite fitting for this era of American history. From afar, America looked like this wonderful land of opportunity, all of the sunshine and daisies.
Buttermellow.
Pardon?
Turn this stupid fat rat yellow.
I'm gonna keep talking now, if that's alright.
Go right ahead.
But upon closer inspection, it wasn't too great. At this time, urbanization was rampant. The populations of the cities were exploding, and the infrastructure couldn't keep up. Many lived in tenements with terrible conditions. Then those people were forced to work in factories and sweatshops, also with aberrant conditions and wages. This was a vicious recursive cycle of desperation, which opened them up to consequent exploitation, which begat more desperation. Basically, the poor were getting poorer, while the businessmen, the Carnegies, Rockefellers, and J.P. Morgans of the world, were getting richer and richer. The wealth gap was expanding rapidly.
So much for trickle-down economics.
That's just a bunch of nonsense. Then these robber bands turn around and have the gall to pretend that they're good people with their occasional charitable donation. It really makes my blood boil, and it made the common people's blood boil too. They started to form unions and strike, but more importantly for our discussion, the Populist Party began to rise.
The Populist Party?
Yep, but as a third party, it's not surprising you don't know much about them. Even back then, they knew they weren't really going anywhere, so their platform was absorbed by the Democrats. And this is really just the first small hint of the modern-day switch the Republicans and Democrats would make.
Well, this is all great stuff, but we gotta go to break. Don't leave, we'll be right back with more Professor George.
This program shall resume in a moment.
This is the Quatious Podcast, and we're sitting here with the Professor George. So, we were just talking about how the Democratic Party integrated the Populist Party's platform into their own. But what were the planks of this newly formed platform? Wow, that was a mouthful.
Right, so just to clarify something, though the Democrats had populist planks, they were far from the Party of Progress we know today.
Alright, so in addition to the populist planks, could you give us the general overview of the issues the early 20th century progressives were fighting for?
Okay, so the populists address more of the economic issues of the Gilded Age, like working conditions, 8-hour workdays, and graduated income taxes. But the progressive movement, in addition to populist ideals, focused on societal injustices. Yeah, the feminists and civil rights activists really started to ramp up here.
And who were some of the big names in these movements?
Well, for the feminists, the most famous was probably Susan B. Anthony, right? But there was also Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, and Florence Kelly, to name a few. This first wave of feminism focused mostly on gaining universal suffrage, and they accomplished that with the 19th Amendment. But there was also a little focus on temperance in there, which actually led to a period of prohibition in the United States.
With a hatchet in one hand and a Bible in the other. Oh boy, oh boy!
Yeah, that mad woman Carrie Nation, right? But you can't forget the civil rights movement. For this movement, the two most influential ones were probably W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Now, Washington wanted black Americans to focus on economic growth. That way they could gradually chip away at the racism in this country. Du Bois, on the other hand, wanted black Americans to have immediate political and social equality.
Wasn't there another guy that kind of just gave up on America, which it's very hard to blame him for at the time, right? And wanted African Americans to just rediscover their African roots.
I think you're referencing Marcus Garvey and his Back to Africa movement.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, he was actually deported, seen as a national threat. He was. And unfortunately, this is opposite to what was to become of the entire movement. It would not enjoy the successes that the feminists had. It would take decades more to even come close to racial equality. For these decades, we allowed lynchings and the other forms of the most hideous, sadistic sides of human nature to remain prevalent. And you know what? Unsurprisingly, the government didn't do jack. Sorry. Let's just say that the first anti-lynching legislation was passed in 2022. Yeah, you heard me right. It's absolutely ridiculous and unacceptable.
This is traumatic history, but we don't ignore it here at the Quatious Podcast. In spite of some states' attempts to cancel American history, we continue to learn it. Next up, modern progressivism. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of this guy, Professor George.
This program shall resume in a moment.
You're back, listening to the Quatious Podcast, and we're about to discuss modern progressivism. So what's been going on in the 21st century?
While gender and racial equality continue to be fought for, we have made many improvements in those aspects. Of course, reproductive rights for women and voting rights for minorities are very sadly continuing to be put in jeopardy. But some newer sub-movements of progressivism have started to pop up. You're seeing environmentalism, LGBTQ plus rights, healthcare.
I mean, geez Louise, guys. And by guys, I mean you politicians up there. Most of these are no-brainers. I mean, healthcare. Aren't we like the only developed nation on Earth not have it universally? And LGBTQ plus rights. What happened to minding our own gosh darn businesses? What's it to you if someone's attracted one way, another way, both ways, or no ways?
Preach.
This ain't a politics podcast, but come on, man.
Though there are a good number of politicians that deserve your calling them out for their complacency, there are a good few as well that have been fighting hard. Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example. Oh yeah, and here's a pet peeve of mine.
Pet peeves? Oh yeah.
I feel like you don't know what pet peeves are, but
Nah.
anyways, there's only so much you can excuse with age. I understand that these folks grew up in a different time, so to a certain extent I get that their little amnesty is provided to them. Okay, great. But y'all messed up the earth, and now you're gonna turn around and try to fight me when I'm trying to fix your blunders? Come on. Another example of age not being a good excuse is Mr. Bernie Sanders. This man marched with Dr. King and has been fighting for the American people since his 20s, not dodging the draft because of his bone spurs. Getting back on track for my tangents, the results of this era's progressivism can be seen in bills such as the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, which has given over 40 million Americans access to health care.
Oh, healthcare is rad.
Sure, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which gave a large amount of funds to climate research.
Oh, giving large amounts of funds to climate research through an act to reduce inflation is rad.
Are you just gonna keep parroting what I'm saying?
Oh, parrot. Well, you thought. So I've heard this term being thrown around a bunch by certain media outlets. I even use it in our quote-unquote sponsor's ad. But to be honest, I feel like most people don't actually know what woke means. Could you give us some insight there?
Well, wokeness, despite what a lot of people believe, is inherently a good thing. Or, no, not even that. It just means having eyes. It means that you're aware of the very real and ever-present injustices of today's world. Now, here's the distinction you have to make, though. There's performative wokeness, characterized by excessive outrage and cancel culture, and that's just what a very small, shouty minority engages in, and it's simply for societal conformity. It's very important to make that distinction between these two attitudes of performative outrage and actual progressive movements, right? But not enough people are making that distinction. When you see wokeism on those news outlets, if you can even call them that, just understand that you're most likely seeing the warped, pigeonholed definition of that term.
We're almost done here. Go ahead and put a nice, flowy ribbon to tie it all up.
Alright, so I know. I get it. I understand that I may have come across as angry today. But I like to think of it as passionate. I think we need more passion in this nation, particularly in the youth. What we don't need is more thoughts and prayers after a school shooting. No, what we don't need is for those thoughts and prayers people to go and tell us to not make this political. With all due respect, how else do you solve problems? Now, that doesn't mean the politicians will proactively solve the problems. You can give up on that right now. The deal is, we the people need to spur those politicians up in DC and also in our own communities. We the people need to create that spark. We the people, as Dr. King wrote in his letter from Birmingham jail, need to stop fearing the tension. We the people need to have the important conversations. And I'm going to stop saying we the people now, but you get the point. It's up to us, guys. Stop blaming the politicians. Look at yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, how can I help my country progress into a future of more kindness and acceptance? Throughout all of American history, the flame of progress has been tried, tested, suppressed, but never put out. The torch has been passed on to us. The question is, are we going to be the generation that lets that flame go out? Are we going to allow the wannabe dictators and theocrats rule? Or are we going to preserve the torch of democracy? I don't mean to sound cliche, but I also do, you know? The deal is, I really want to just underscore the fragility and significance of these fundamental American ideals, because that's what we are. That's what we've been. America has been the trailblazers. Throughout its history, America has always been the country of progress. Whew, okay, that's enough now.
Deep as, bro. Alrighty then, that'll be all for the Quatious podcast today. Professor George, thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always,
Stay
stay
quacious.
quacious.
This program is over. Look away, for the captivating content is coming to a close. This veritably fulfilling dissemination of knowledge has concluded. Please leave. This extremely well thought out, not at all hackneyed project has ended. Thus, I cannot possibly comprehend your continued presence.